I think we heard on many of the talks earlier today that AI is playing a more significant role as we move ahead. And I do think that we tend to have a little bias towards using AI for detection, identifying risk, identifying threats, detecting attackers. So what we wanted to do on this talk today is to share some practical examples of how we use AI for the response part. Identifying all these issues and detecting issues is obviously fundamental to respond to threats. But what do we do when this happens? And this is the jobs that we provide and that we do day in and day out at Theos. We're the fastest growing MSSP in the Philippines. And so we'll share a case study where our team here in Manila responding to a pretty serious ransomware attack just a couple of months ago. And we'll show you practical examples of how we use AI to accelerate the response and ultimately save that organization from potentially some damaging outcomes. So what you'll see here is the actual events that occurred. You will see that it happened on the 30th of May, 2024, so it's pretty recent. You'll see real timeline, real timestamps, and the actual steps that our team took, and hopefully some examples that you can actually take back to your own SOC on very practical steps. No magics in here, no black box with AI and you don't really know what happens. Very practical examples that you could literally just use for yourselves as well and improve your MTTR. So first of all, what happened? And if you worked in a SOC before, or maybe some of your team members or previous life, you worked in a SOC, when you see your dashboard and your monitoring starts to light up, you know that this is going to be a tough day. You start to receive a lot of alerts. Perhaps some AI engine detected that something is going on, and all of a sudden, all the lights go on, and your team starts to look into this. And so on that day, we received roughly 10, 20-ish alerts within a very, very short amount of time. So clearly something is going on. And from there, ISLA dictates that someone has to look into alerts within 15 minutes. And so, that's what we normally do. And so we start to look into these alerts. And again, there is some very clever technology behind the scene that figured out that some indicator of attacks seems to suggest that an event is going on. There seems to be some ransomware that's trying to be deployed over SMB, which is network sharing protocol. And thankfully, the tool that actually detected it blocks it, which is good in nature. So some attempts are being made within the infrastructure of that particular organization, and the technology is doing its job. It's detecting it, it's blocking it, all great. And you could argue that if you get these sort of detections and it says, well, it's been blocked, then actually job done. You could just leave it at that and move on. The technology has picked it up, the technology has blocked it. Technology works, sometimes. But in the course of an investigation, and what you do in a SOC is you try to go further than this. You don't take the information just as as it's presented to you. You try to go further, try to understand, try to get context, try to see what's really happening here. And so as the analysts start to go and look into the particular assets where the alert is coming up, some time goes and they log onto the machines, they look into files, they cannot see any ransomware, they cannot see any files being encrypted, so everything seems normal. Yet, eventually they come across this note, and this is the actual note we found on the servers. So essentially on the desktop of those servers was just a simple text file that reads, as you can see here, our name is the Black Basta Syndicate. We are business people just like you. We have encrypted your file, and obviously, contact us, and you'll get information on how to pay a ransom for us to, decrypt, etc. Now we find this note, but nothing is encrypted. So what's going on here? Well, first off, who is Black Basta? Before we go into what happens next. So Black Basta indeed is one of the most prominent ransomware syndicate out there. They are responsible for hundreds and hundreds of millions of ransomware deployment and ransoms being paid, unfortunately. And what's interesting is that just like as they say, we are business people, they indeed are business people. And what it means is they use regularly the same tools. They use the same techniques. They use the same protocols. They use the same tactics. And so their specialties, amongst others, is, for example, double extortion, meaning They encrypt your files, they ask you for a ransom, you pay, and then they ask you again. That's the typical MO that this particular group adopts. The tools they use are usually the same. They like to use rclone, they like to use CobbleStrike for the CNC command and control. And so normally you would have detection rules, you would have mechanisms in order to detect those type of tools or those type of activities. In the case of CobbleStrike, for example, very well-known tools that are used by red teamers or that are used by attackers to get command and control infrastructure. But what about rclone? What about just remote desktop? You can't really build detection rules about detecting remote desktop because everyone uses remote desktop in a just normal system administration setting. But the important part here is, because of this intelligence, you know who you're facing, and you know what tools and what tactics they adopt. So you can, instead of just being on the defensive and try to figure out, okay, what are they going to do next? What should be my move? You can actually go and hunt them in the infrastructure. And this is where we start to see, aside from the detection side, how we can leverage AI in a very, very practical way. And so as part of the investigation, what we did next is that we identify the tools that they are using, in this case, for example, rclone, and we go and proactively hunt for signs of rclone within the entire infrastructure to try to see where are they within our network, where are they on our servers. And so a very practical way that you can leverage AI to accelerate this response and to accelerate these investigations is to put together threat hunting queries. Now, it normally takes an analyst, roughly between an hour, 2 hours maybe, to put together a query to go and look for a specific tool. But you can bring that down to a couple of seconds. And so one of the ways that you can very practically accelerate your investigation and response is to build a library of queries such as this one. And so the day you're looking for a tool, the query is generic, the query is the same. And we've been using it many, many times. Please screenshot it so you can use it in your own SOC. And so instead of spending 2 hours trying to code the query, trying to test it, trying to see if it works or it doesn't work, we just put it into the our in this case, a Gen AI tool. We got the query, we use it, and we hunt. And so we don't spend 2 hours engineering a query. We spend the time actually investigating and looking for the threat actor. And the outcome is brilliant. Within 2 minutes, we found 16 assets with signs of rclone activity on it within the last 24 hours. Now, manually, if you had tried to do this, it would have taken you hours. Now we know which assets this activity has been seen on, and we know what's the next step. We obviously have to contain them. There is very, very high likelihood that the threat actor is actively on these assets. Now, next very practical steps on what to do in this kind of scenario. So you've identified those assets. Your next course of action, because of a playbook, because of an AI told you, or because you just know incident response, is very likely to contain those assets. Now, in our setting, we obviously do this for third-party organizations, and you don't just go and contain servers and take them offline because there's potential impact on production, operation, and business impact. So you have to go and explain the situation to that counterparty, explain that situation to your business partner and to whoever the asset belongs to convince them, explain to them what's happening, convince them that the right step is to actually contain, and you need their authorization. So same here, and again, very, very practically speaking. As an analyst, you have to explain what happens. You have to write an email or write a ticket or write a query, send that to whoever is the owner of the assets, and convince that person to say, yes, contain the assets. How long is that going to take you to write that communication, to write that email, to write that report? And the time it takes you, say 30 minutes, 20 minutes, 10 minutes if you do this every day, maybe if it's a client or a CISO or a CEO, you're going to read it a couple of times before you send it, just to make sure you're not saying something wrong, right? Again, very, very practical step. We've built a number of templates, and depending on the profile of the client, we input information about the ticket, the information of the alert or the attack that's going on, and the profile of the company or the profile of the client we want to send that to. And in response, we get a template communication that is clear, well-worded, in proper English, properly formatted, proper language, convincing, non-biased, hopefully, and action-oriented. This is what's happening. This is what we have done. This is what needs to happen next. Do I have the authorization to proceed? All we need is a yes, and then we can go ahead and proceed. Again, we saved with this library of communications that have been optimized over time, and we've trained the model to write the right way, in a convincing manner, but objective and clear and concise. We've saved, again, another 30 minutes or so in time to respond, because at this point, there's still no containment, right? And so from the moment we get a yes, then we can proceed. And if you look at the timestamps, from the moment we found the note, the moment we started containment, only 2 minutes happened. And this is the real timestamp. The client was obviously very responsive in that case. They just said yes right away. 2 minutes from the moment that we found the issue, mapped it to a threat actor, did the threat hunting, found the assets, and then contained them. 2 minutes. Now from there, the rest of the response occurs. So remember at the beginning, it was a ransomware attack over SMB. So you contain the host, you prevent the spread by blocking SMB protocol and blocking communication across locations just to prevent the spread. And then lastly, the investigation continued and we identified actually what accounts were being used in order for that ransomware to be installed in the first place. And then ultimately, what was the original account that was compromised before privilege escalation. Lastly, VPN terminated. That was the actual original entry point. Eventually, and if you look at the time that goes on in here, and we have a recap, I think, after that, from the moment that the attack occurred to the moment somebody started investigating, only 10 minutes occurred. From that time, the investigation took about an hour until the note was found, until systems and the situation was understood. And then from there, 2 minutes later, the first response action was triggered. If you had to do all of these things manually, it would very likely have taken you hours. And an hour or two in response is the difference between an incident and a ransomware being deployed and your company being completely locked down versus you preventing it before it happens and eventually just carrying on with your day. So if we sort of compare those type of timelines, so this is what the timeline would have looked at if we basically would have done everything manually just the way it is done in the majority of the SOCs today in the security operations centers. An attack is detected. There is some kind of SLA, usually 10 minutes, 15 minutes if you're pretty on. Sometimes some SOCs are a little longer, an hour, 2 hours, 4 hours before somebody actually investigates the alert. Next, obviously analysis, investigation, understanding what happens. Maybe if nobody had found this ransom note, we don't know what would have happened because that gave us obviously a very good clue on who was the threat actor. And then deciding on how to find the activity, how to locate them in the infrastructure, how to understand what they are doing and what they're about to do, and then responding to this. We estimate that it would have taken about in excess of 2 hours until the first response action if we had to do all of this manually. And 2 hours, if you think about it, is still pretty good. 2 hours to respond. There you go. A little bit less than 2 hours. Now, just by introducing some, those very simple, well, somehow simple practical steps using GenAI for the query library that we built, for the communications, and also for the attribution to the threat actor that I showed at the beginning, we reduced this time pretty much twofold. And so the time from the moment somebody investigated to the first response action was less than 1 hour. And if you consume enough threat intelligence, according to CrowdStrike, I know they have bad publicity these days, but one thing they're very good at is threat intelligence. The average time to break out when an attacker gains a foothold on your infrastructure is 62 minutes. That's the average time over 2023. So if the time that it takes you from detection to response is more than 62 minutes, more than 50% of the time, you will be too late. And that ransomware would have deployed. Now, in this case, 60 minutes, we're just below average, which is pretty good already. But in a practical term, we faced a very reputable, credible threat actor. Black Basta is renowned globally for being one of the most, again, prolific threat actor out there for ransomware attacks. And it did indeed take them more than that time lapse to deploy the ransomware, and we were able to respond faster and prevent that ransomware from being deployed. And we saved this company, obviously, a great deal of damage. So the way we tend to think about AI is, there's this black box here that does some magical thing and identify threats, or can figure out that something interesting is going on that we should look into. And we need those tools, we need those technologies, we need those capabilities, because they help enhance our ability to detect and to identify potential threat actors. But AI is not just black magic and rely on a tool to do something magical for us and replace our jobs. We are of the opinion that you need to use AI as your assistant, as your co-pilot, as your little consultant on the side that does those mundane tasks and that makes you do a lot more, a lot faster, a lot better. And so I encourage all of you to think about some examples like this where you can leverage things that are not as fancy as a black box that finds magical things, but rather how do you practically leverage those technologies to make your job easier, faster, more interesting. And the interesting thing is that the analysts we have in the SOC, they love this. They prefer working with these tools and using them in this manner rather than going through logs and trying to code queries. They don't like to do this. It's fun once, but it's not fun if you have to do this every day. They really like that, we are leveraging those technologies, and it makes their job funnier, more interesting, faster, and ultimately they do more interesting stuff. And so that works very well for talent retention as well, as a side note. What are the key takeaways here? First of all, speed. Leverage AI and leverage technology to accelerate the way you do things, particularly in a detection, response kind of setting. Because minutes count when it comes to incident response, and it could be the difference between preventing a ransomware from being deployed versus having to call your leadership that half your infrastructure is unfortunately offline and then you have to shut down operation. Imagine that call. You do not want to make that call. So for us, speed is key. And we leverage tools not just for detection, but also to help in the response, to make it faster, more accurate, and ultimately reduce the mean time to response. Second, in this particular case, it did save the day, so to speak. And if we look at the statistics, and if we look at the time, clearly, if we had not leveraged those tools, it's very likely that the ransomware would have been deployed and that we would have eventually had to do some recovery instead of preventing the incident. And so a very practical outcome here is that leveraging those technologies and implementing them in a very practical way as part of our process and as part of the tools that our SOC analysts are empowered to use, reduced our mean time to response by more than 50%. And so think about your current MTTR. I assume many of you are measuring it today. Imagine that you could reduce it by 50% just by doing some simple steps like this. So hopefully that's useful. You can take some of these back to your organizations. Hopefully you took a screenshot of the queries that we showed earlier. But again, thank you. These are very practical steps, and happy to share more if you'd like on the panel later or around the conference today. Thank you very much.